The klaxon shrieked through the damp Berlin night of October 1942, rattling window panes and jolting officers from their bunks. For a moment they thought it was another British bomber raid, yet the skies were quiet. The alarm was not for bombs. It was for a message intercepted across a crackling channel, a message that suggested something unthinkable. A German attaché in America had glimpsed Henry Ford's tank production lines. What he described made hardened staff officers sit in silence, the echo of boots on the marble floor the only sound. Was Hitler's empire already doomed, not by Soviet rifles or British planes, but by Detroit's relentless machinery? The report arrived in fragments, smuggled in diplomatic pouches, and couriered across neutral territories. Quartermaster tallies noted the claims with unease. Assembly halls stretching a quarter-mile, conveyor belts dragging armored hulls forward like cattle on rails, and welders working in shifts so endless that sparks rained day and night. To the German staff who had lived through shortages of steel and rubber, such scales sounded like myth. Yet the attaché insisted he had walked the floor himself, guided by an American engineer who bragged that production is only warming up. Imagine a black and white photograph, grainy and blurred, showing shadowed men in fedoras reading a typed page beneath a shaded lamp. Their faces betray fear more than skepticism. Could one factory truly build more tanks in a week than Germany managed in a month? The first shock was numerical. The envoy estimated that by late 1942, American lines could complete 500 medium tanks each week. German records of the same period noted fewer than 300 tanks rolling out monthly from all Reich facilities combined. Even accounting for propaganda exaggeration, the gap loomed like a chasm. Officers whispered of mass production they could not replicate. One colonel scribbled in the margin of the report, "If true, no campaign in the East can be sustained." The attaché added unsettling sensory details. He wrote of the metallic scent of grease and oil thick in the air, of deafening hammer strokes pounding rhythmically like war drums, of the blinding arcs of welding torches that seemed to stretch into infinity. In Detroit, laborers did not toil by candle or blackout lamp. Their factories blazed with electricity even at midnight. To a German officer accustomed to rationed coal and brownout orders, the thought was unbearable. How could the Reich, with every ounce of coal diverted to the front, hope to match that luminosity? A second revelation arrived with a human twist. One supervisor, proud of his plant, handed the envoy a stamped metal plate from a Sherman tank's chassis. "This number," he boasted, "is one of thousands. Every day adds more." The envoy pocketed it as proof, smuggling the cold scrap across the Atlantic. When it landed on a mahogany desk in Berlin, officers passed it hand to hand. It was not propaganda, it was steel reality. Camera ready again. A stark tableau of officers in uniform leaning over a single piece of metal lying on felt cloth. Their expressions blur, but the tension is clear. In that moment, numbers transformed into destiny. Not all were convinced. Some argued that American abundance was unfocused, that quality would falter. "So they build refrigerators and automobiles," one skeptic muttered. "Our tank is not a sedan." Yet whispers spread of production methods lifted directly from automobile plants, where conveyor belts moved not wheels and dashboards, but turrets and cannon. The German automobile sector, strangled by war priorities, could scarcely repair civilian trucks, let alone build armored battalions. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler were rewriting the industrial war itself. By the close of 1942, the Wehrmacht bled on two fronts, Stalingrad in the east, El Alamein in the deserts of Africa. Supplies of fuel and rubber dwindled. Reports from Detroit hinted at rivers of both, funneled in from the American heartland where railroads carried raw ore in endless convoys. One railway ledger, later captured by intelligence, logged 7,000 tons of steel moving into Michigan plants in a single week. German planners knew they could not dream of such flows without stripping occupied nations bare. Then came the most chilling comparison. American planners aimed to field 45,000 tanks by 1944. Hitler's own projections, scrawled on Reich Chancellery stationery, optimistically promised 12,000 in the same period. The attaché's coded cable concluded with a bleak phrase, "Quantität ist eine Waffe," quantity itself is a weapon. Officers in Berlin folded the message with trembling hands. In the corridors, one muttered a prayer, more for his sons at the front than for the Führer. Every 250 words the tension mounted, and with it the grim realization. Germany's fate might be sealed not by battles fought today, but by machines that had not yet crossed the Atlantic. The thunder of Detroit's presses was already echoing across the world. Though muffled by distance, on the human side, letters from soldiers at Stalingrad told of tanks running on frozen oil, of engines seizing at dawn, of crews scavenging spare parts from wrecks. One corporal wrote home that he brewed weak cocoa over a fire made from splintered floorboards inside a captured house. The image of warmth contrasted cruelly with the news from America, factories where hot coffee was served in break rooms, where workers rotated shifts to keep machines alive, and where spare parts were stamped by the ton. A soldier's cocoa mug against a factory's flood of steel, such was the imbalance. A candid photograph could show the contrast. Frost-covered German tank crews huddled around a small tin cup, their faces hollow. Thousands of miles away, another photo would reveal American workers in coveralls, sparks flying as they welded turret seams, sweat glistening despite the winter cold. Two worlds, one destined to eclipse the other. As autumn 1942 deepened, the intelligence officers who handled the Ford reports faced a dilemma. Should they present them to Hitler, knowing his wrath would fall on messengers of bad news, or should they bury the documents, hoping the tide of war might still turn by miracle? Some chose silence, yet the numbers were undeniable, etched into steel plates and echoing in factory halls. The Reich was running a race it had already lost, though its leaders could not admit it. The klaxon that had wailed that October night faded into memory, replaced by a deeper dread. Because the truth was dawning. Detroit was not merely building tanks. It was building inevitability, and soon, the men in Berlin would learn just how unstoppable that inevitability could become. What the German officers could not yet know was that the thunder of Detroit's presses was only the overture. The full symphony of American industrial might had not even begun, and when it did, the front lines of Europe would tremble. Smoke drifted above the Rouge River plant, like a storm cloud that never moved, a haze born of molten steel and hot oil. In early 1943, German attachés who had once sneered at American assembly line culture now filed grim updates. The scale of Detroit's war production was something no Wehrmacht planner had foreseen. The Reich had imagined a nation distracted by jazz clubs and baseball diamonds. What they discovered was an arsenal capable of building more armored divisions in a year than Hitler could hope to assemble in 3. Ford's great factory complex stretched across 1,000 acres. Quartermaster logs smuggled back to Berlin mentioned 93 buildings, 100 miles of railroad within the walls, and enough furnaces to pour steel for 500 tanks weekly. To those accustomed to German plants of modest size, this was like describing a city that breathed fire and thunder. And unlike German factories vulnerable to British raids, these halls roared on without interruption, shielded by geography and distance. Archival photos from the period capture it perfectly. Silhouettes of men in goggles, sparks cascading like fireworks, tank hulls moving nose to tail along conveyor belts. Grain scratches and blur turn the images into something raw, but they also hint at the unstoppable rhythm. Not one hull at a time, but dozens in sequence, each welded seam following the next. Numbers mounted quickly. Production figures in U.S. War Department bulletins boasted that 1942 had already seen 24,000 armored vehicles delivered. The German record for that same year was barely 1/3. One colonel scrawled across a captured leaflet, "If correct, this alone decides the war." He was not exaggerating. By 1943, the Americans aimed at 65,000. Tanks and self-propelled guns and arithmetic. That seemed closer to fantasy than fact for officers who counted each ton of steel with dread. The factory floor was more than machines. It was choreography. Conveyor chains rattled overhead, carrying engines like iron carcasses. Below, workers in coveralls passed rivet guns back and forth, the staccato beat echoing like machine gun fire. Every 90 minutes, supervisors claimed, a finished tank rolled off the line, tested and fueled. To Germanize, this was heresy. A tank was supposed to be crafted, not stamped. But the photographs didn't lie. In Detroit, tanks were becoming as common as sedans once had been. At every 250-word turn came another reveal. Logistics. America had oil, steel, and rubber in staggering quantities. One War Production Board report logged 300,000 barrels of synthetic rubber produced monthly by mid-1943, enough for tracks and seals. Germany struggled with ersatz substitutes, brittle and unreliable in the Russian cold. Coal trains arriving at Ruhr plants carried 2,000 tons a day at best. American railroads hauled 5 times that to a single Detroit complex, and the supply chain stretched beyond Detroit. Cleveland for engines, Pittsburgh for steel, Chicago for gears, Akron for tires. Each city turned into a cog in the arsenal. When the German High Command compared notes, they saw not one factory, but a continent functioning as one machine. The myth of isolationism dissolved. The United States had become an industrial fortress, and its walls were rivers, railways, and assembly lines. For workers on the ground, it was a different rhythm. Letters preserved in archives reveal exhaustion and pride intermingled. A young woman from Dearborn wrote her fiancé overseas, "Every time I drill a rivet, I imagine it holding your tank safe." A chaplain visiting the plant led a quiet prayer at shift change, his words drowned by the roar of furnaces. Human beats softened the statistics. Coffee breaks with tin mugs. A mechanic wiping grease onto his sleeve before handling a letter from home. Foremen encouraging weary crews with promises that each finished Sherman meant fewer American graves. The camera-ready tableau. A woman in scarf and goggles guiding a welding torch across a turret seam. Sparks bouncing onto her boots, her eyes steady. Grain and blur give the scene permanence. The Reich skepticism wavered further when they learned of modularity. American design sacrificed elegance for replaceability. A Sherman transmission could be swapped in hours. German Panthers required days and teams of specialists. A field log from Kursk recorded, "Our tanks superior in firepower, yet half are immobile within 48 hours due to mechanical failure." What mattered was not sophistication, but repeatability. Detroit was producing repeatability in steel. Even more staggering were the warehouses. Stacks of spare parts lined by the acre, crates labeled with serials, all logged with precision. American quartermasters counted not in dozens, but in tens of thousands. By contrast, German tank commanders often cannibalized wrecks just to keep one machine moving. In Berlin, officers reading those reports must have felt the floor tilt beneath them. As 1943 rolled on, the numbers broke into headlines. 86,000 tanks and self-propelled vehicles projected by war's end. German intelligence conceded that even if half failed, the other half would still outnumber Reich production. It was the triumph of abundance over perfection, and it was a calculus Hitler's ideology never considered. For him, the will of the folk was decisive. But in truth, it was the rhythm of machines, the hiss of steam and the clang of presses. One poignant image closes this chapter, a break room inside the Ford plant. Workers sit slumped, lunch pails open, radio crackling with war news. On the table lies a folded newspaper reporting German advances near Kharkov. Yet behind them, through a glass wall, another tank rolls forward on the line, indifferent to headlines, unstoppable. The German officers who saw such images and heard such figures realized the war was shifting beneath their boots. The Reich could terrorize, it could blitz, it could innovate, but it could not outproduce. And as the attaché's final note warned, these factories do not rest. They are awake while we sleep. What no one yet knew was how these numbers would translate into the mud of Italy, the hedgerows of France, and the frozen forests of Belgium. Detroit's rhythm would echo on those battlefields in ways Berlin could scarcely imagine. The winter wind cut across a Michigan field in early 1944, carrying the metallic tang of industry. Beyond the fence line stood not farmers, but rows of parked Shermans, their gun barrels tipped with frost. For prisoners of war brought to the Midwest, captured Germans transported thousands of miles from battle, the sight was unnerving. They had been raised to believe in German superiority, yet here they stood, watching tank after tank idle like surplus cattle waiting for shipment. The ideology they carried began to crack, not in interrogation rooms, but in factory yards. The United States held more than 370,000 Axis POWs by 1945, with camps scattered across 46 states. Many were set to work on farms or inside industrial plants under strict supervision. In one such camp near Dearborn, German soldiers were contracted to clean foundry floors, stack crates of gears, or haul scrap steel into bins that would soon be melted back into armor. Quartermaster tallies show that by June 1944, POW labor in Michigan contributed nearly 1 million man-hours. For men accustomed to shortages and scarcities at home, the abundance of food, light, and machinery left them stunned. Picture a candid photograph, a line of captured soldiers still in worn field coats, unloading crates marked spare Ford Motor Corps, while snowflakes blur across the frame. Their faces are tired but not brutalized, the black and white grain giving the moment both dignity and irony. Life in the camps was Spartan but humane. Rations included meat, bread, and coffee. Luxuries compared with what their families now endured under Allied bombing. Letters intercepted by censors record their surprise. One wrote to his wife in Bremen, "They feed us bacon at breakfast. You cannot imagine." Another described a camp canteen where he tasted cocoa for the first time since 1941. American guards enforced discipline, but chaplains offered Sunday prayers, and the Red Cross delivered parcels with cigarettes and soap. The effect was subtle but undeniable. Comparison bred doubt. If America could feed and house its enemies with such resources, what did that say about the Reich's promises of supremacy? German ideology had demanded loyalty to the fatherland. Yet under Detroit's floodlights, surrounded by tank hulls stacked like cordwood, the myths eroded. Field reports from U.S. interrogators note a shift. Fewer declarations of inevitable German victory, more silent stares when confronted with production statistics. One prisoner told an officer, "I believed Germany built the best machines. Now I see you build the most, perhaps that wins wars." Inside the plants, civilian workers sometimes brushed shoulders with these captives. Women on riveting crews recalled Germans staring at the conveyor lines with muted disbelief. A Detroit machinist remembered lending a wrench to a POW who studied it like a relic. That wrench was one of thousands. The POW confessed he had once waited months for such a tool back home. Small moments revealed vast gulfs. Numbers made the contrast sharper. By spring 1944, American output reached 2,000 tanks a month. German production limped at 600. Even when Berlin introduced formidable Panthers and Tigers, the imbalance remained. One German sergeant confined in Michigan reportedly muttered, "A tiger is mighty, but what if the forest is endless?" His words echoed what staff officers in Berlin had already feared, that the Reich's machines, however powerful, would drown in a sea of Shermans. Imagine a grainy photograph of POWs leaning against barbed wire fencing. Behind them, a yard bristling with tank turrets awaiting shipment. The contrast between frail human figures and looming steel silhouettes captures the futility they felt. Farm life deepened the irony. Thousands of prisoners were dispatched to rural fields, harvesting sugar beets, corn, or hay. Farmers tallied their productivity. One Michigan county logged 80,000 prisoner man-days in a single harvest season. The captives sweated under American skies, hearing radio broadcasts of Allied advances in Normandy. For men who once believed their tanks would crush all resistance, pulling beets from soil beside American tractors became a humbling education. Some farmers even shared sandwiches at noon, another subtle dismantling of ideology. The cracks widened with news from home. Letters carried fragments of Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne. Cities blackened by bombing, families displaced. In contrast, Detroit's factories glowed uninterrupted, spewing tanks by the hundreds. POW diaries later recovered spoke of cognitive dissonance. Our people starve, yet America wastes bread on prisoners. Who has chosen the righteous path? The more they saw, the less the Nazi narrative held. One humane beat stands out. On Christmas Eve 1944, a camp chaplain in Michigan arranged for prisoners and guards alike to sing carols in a drafty hall lit by a single tree strung with electric bulbs. German voices rose with Stille Nacht, American voices joined with Silent Night. The words matched, if not the language. In that shared melody, men glimpsed something outside ideology, a recognition that humanity persisted even in war's furnace. The forward hook comes with the realization that these quiet cracks in belief mirrored the larger fractures at the front. For as the POWs stacked crates in Detroit, their comrades still fighting in Europe were encountering the steel fruits of that labor. Germans rolled off American lines in such numbers that every destroyed tank seemed instantly replaced. German officers knew it. Prisoners in Michigan felt it. And when the spring of 1944 turned toward a stormy June, the true consequence of Detroit's rhythm would be unveiled on the beaches of France. The dawn of June 6, 1944, broke over the English Channel with a grey haze, the kind of light that flattened sea and sky into one endless sheet. Allied commanders called it Operation Neptune, but to the men storming ashore it was simply survival. Beneath the rumble of naval guns, a truth forged far from the beaches revealed itself. Every Sherman tank grinding onto the sand, every landing craft stacked with crates, every replacement rifle waiting on a ship's deck owed its existence to Detroit and the factories inland. This was not a battle fought only by soldiers. It was a battle decided by assembly lines thousands of miles away. German defenders braced behind bunkers, counted barrels and shells. But what they could not count was the torrent about to arrive. Allied ordnance logs recorded 176,000 vehicles assigned to the Normandy invasion. A staggering portion of that, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, had been stamped, welded and assembled in the industrial heart of America. No German officer on the cliffs could imagine such scale, yet here it came. Wave after wave. Picture a candid photograph, black and white grain. A Sherman tank crawling through surf, soldiers crouched behind it as water splashes against its hull. In the distance, more silhouettes wait, like an endless procession. The grain and scratches make it almost dreamlike. But the message is clear. This is abundance incarnate. Statistics mounted into proof. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced over 88,000 tanks. Germany managed fewer than 46,000, even while draining occupied territories of resources. Detroit's numbers were not abstract. They clanked across hedgerows, smashed through bocage and rumbled down cobblestone streets of French villages. Quartermasters tallied replacements so vast that Allied divisions could lose dozens of tanks in a single day and still push forward by morning. German commanders, meanwhile, hoarded fuel for single counterattacks, knowing replacements were weeks away if they arrived at all. Human moments punctuated the math. Letters from GIs describe cocoa, heated over makeshift stoves in Normandy barns, the steam mingling with the smell of hay and gun oil. One soldier wrote home, "We lost the tank beside me yesterday. This morning a new one arrived like nothing happened." For him, it was reassurance. For the enemy, it was despair. As the campaign spread through France, Detroit's shadow lengthened. In August 1944, when the Falaise Pocket collapsed, German survivors left hundreds of burned vehicles along the roads. American recovery teams counted them like wreckage in a scrapyard. By that point, U.S. production had already delivered replacements for every loss and more besides. Berlin's staff officers who once dismissed those attaché reports from 1942 now saw them, confirmed in smoking steel across Europe. Imagine a blurred archival shot of a roadside ditch, filled with abandoned German armor, children peering from behind rubble. Across the frame, an American convoy of fresh Shermans rolls by, turret steady, tracks unscarred. The contrast is visual testimony. Detroit's factories had reached the battlefield. By winter, the Ardennes offered one last German gamble. Hitler threw his panzers into the snow, banking on surprise. At first they advanced, fuel tanks filled from desperate reserves. But once again, logistics told the tale. American records show that in December 1944 alone, over 17,000 armored vehicles were delivered to Europe. Germany built barely 500. When fog lifted and Allied supply lines surged, the German thrust withered. Outnumbered not just in tanks, but in the rhythm of resupply, the Wehrmacht's final offensive dissolved. For POWs still laboring in American camps, news filtered through guards and radios. They read of Sherman swarming into Cologne, of German cities turned to rubble, while Detroit blazed with uninterrupted light. Diaries speak of disbelief hardening into resignation. What we saw in Michigan was true. Our defeat is built on their machines. The final camera-ready tableau, VE Day celebrations in Detroit. Factory whistles blare. Workers spill into streets, confetti mixing with soot. In grainy frames, women who once riveted turrets now hold their children aloft. The war had been won not only on Omaha or in the Ardennes, but also in those roaring halls along the Rouge River. The legacy of this industrial miracle stretched far beyond 1945. Europe rebuilt on trucks and tractors once born of tank lines. Veterans returned home to buy automobiles from companies that had kept them alive overseas. German officers who once scorned mass production later admitted in memoirs that it was the decisive weapon, more lethal than any bomb. One even wrote, "Detroit defeated us more thoroughly than Normandy." Epilogue. The story of the war is often told in battles, but battles are fleeting. What endured was the hum of machines, the glow of furnaces, the rhythm of shifts that never slept. America's arsenal did not just supply an army. It overwhelmed an ideology built on illusions of superiority. The German officers who glimpsed Ford's lines in 1942 sensed the truth. Hitler could not match Detroit, and history would prove them right, in steel, in fire, and in freedom.